So I think we can start and if start a problem. And also I'd like to give the go over the introduction first. So is it cool? Can I start? Okay. So welcome to another session of Digital Humanities webinars. Today we have a great guest, Joe Lindsay Walton is a prolific British poet, fiction writer, and editor whose innovative approach to literature has captivated audience both in the UK and abroad, with at least 13 published works spanning poetry, fiction, and experimental writing. Walton is renowned for his creative use of pseudonymity, collaborating under various names such as Lorky Blinks, Harvey Joseph, and Francis Cribb, and more others. He has also authored several books, including Visualizing Uncertainty, Kampala Yenkia, which is a type of a map-making game, and Invocation. Joe is also a research fellow in arts, climate, and technology at the Sussex Humanities Lab, University of Sussex. He's a member of the Digital Humanities Climate Coalition. And today, he will share the insights from his thought-provoking chapter titled AI 2024, Critical Design Fiction in the book Routledge Handbook of AI and Literature. This session will delve into the intricate relation between science fiction and real-world and advancements in AI, particularly focusing on representations of machine learning and their implications in our societies. Great, so without further ado, we can start the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it's really lovely to meet you all. So what I want to talk about today is science fiction especially, but also more widely, all the stories that we tell about the future and how these speculative or anticipatory elements of culture, how they relate to innovation. And hopefully, I want to propose something which takes the orthodox or common sense view of science fiction's relationship with innovation and complicates it a bit, turns it on its head, disrupts it. There isn't a very kind of strong digital humanities angle to any of this, but I hope it will be of interest to you anyway, and perhaps you might see some DH style questions to explore, or some DH kind of angles and lenses on these themes. And mostly this is an extended meditation on a tweet about something called the Torment Nexus, but we will come to that in a little bit. So today's talk is called Critical Design Fiction. And to communicate what this means, we first need to have some background on what design fiction is. Put simply, design fiction is a story that tries to become real. Bruce Sterling, the science fiction writer Bruce Sterling, describes design fiction as a narrative prototype that suspends disbelief about change. He says diegetic prototype. Diegetic is really just a fancy word for narrative. So sometimes that disbelief, it could be the only thing that is keeping some force for change locked up. And the key that will turn in that lock might be a story. So whose disbelief are we talking about? Well, investors, entrepreneurs, technologists, consumers, policymakers, funders, the public, families, the media, early adopters, influencers, tastemakers, religious authorities, civil society, workers, unions, basically anybody with power to make the future. Now, this story, this design fiction story might not be strictly formally a story in the sense of a piece of written fiction. It could be something else. It could take many different forms. It might be a mock commercial or advertisement, a news broadcast from the future. It could be like a tutorial that's taking you through some kind of fictional product, or a documentary. It could be an artifact. It could be something that you hold in your hand, a bit like an artwork. I suppose it could even be a grant application. And design fiction deliberately tries to influence the future. Now, when it comes to science fiction, the kind of broader term of science fiction, we have this assumption, not a bad assumption, we have this assumption that science fiction also sometimes does some of the same things as design fiction does, but in a less deliberate way. It's not setting out to make something real necessarily, but in a way that is kind of more haphazard and accidental, more kind of self-contradictory and stormy. That is something that sometimes happens with science fiction. Now, I won't try and define science fiction here. We might think of related terms as well, like speculative fiction, SF, SFF, subgenres like cyberpunk and solarpunk, utopia and dystopia, indigenous futurisms, Afrofuturism, Gulf futurism, African futurism, Sino-futurism, and I've used a Marvel movie, Black Panther, to indicate that science fiction it's not niche, it's not marginal, it's something that is very mainstream globally, and it's a very kind of intensely commodified mode of culture, or parts of it are. And such fiction, it's often concerned with alternative realities, not the world that we live in. It's often set in the future, although stories set in an enchanted past, or perhaps reviving myth and folklore in the present, can have similar effects. Stories in this way can become a kind of playground or laboratory for thought experiments, for the speculative imagination to conduct experiments in a relatively safe way. The wonderful science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin says that science fiction is descriptive, not predictive. She calls for realists of a larger reality. So in other words, science fiction may imagine a world that is different to the world around us, but actually it is about the world around us as well. It's about its possibilities. It's about what might be obscured from our everyday vision. Science fiction helps us to reflect on reality. In Sheila Jasanoff's terms, science fiction is a repository of socio-technical imaginaries, visions that integrate futures of growing knowledge and technological mastery with normative assessments of what such futures could and should mean for present-day societies. Let's look at some examples that might make it a lot clearer. Here is, in a 1930 short story by Miles Brewer, Paradise and Iron, a self-driving car. It was a clickety-clack and a whir of the motor, and the car moved gently away from the curb. It swerved out into the street, gathered speed, and then turned to the right around a corner. It slowed down for two women crossing the street and avoided a truck coming towards us. It gave me an eerie feeling to sit in the thing and have it carry me around automatically. And here, E.M. Forster predicts us. In The Machine Stops 1909, everybody is living in this kind of gigantic labyrinth of rooms interconnected by something that is suspiciously similar to Google Meet or Zoom. And they're constantly giving one another lectures. They're constantly attending lectures or delivering lectures. It could also maybe be seen as a prefiguration of kind of something like, Instagram or TikTok or Twitch even, kind of live streaming. Above her, beneath her, and around her, the machine hummed eternally. She did not notice the noise, for she had been born with it in her ears. So this idea that science fiction can not just kind of accidentally predict the future because a stopped clock is right twice a day, but can also even exert an influence on the real world, can kind of predict the future because it's played a part in making that future happen. This idea might have been kind of a bit more controversial not that long ago. I think more recently, it's become less controversial, less academic and less abstract, more obvious in our bones and our blood, because we're seeing the influence that multi-billionaire science fiction fans are quite directly exerting on the world stage. Many kind of Silicon Valley tech bros love science fiction, and many of the things that we're trying to make happen are very much kind of science fictional tropes and conceits. And even kind of in the US government, DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, right now is dismantling the state, kind of mixture of privatization and also vandalizing public institutions with the idea of privatizing them somewhere down the line in the future. And the way that they're doing this is shaped not just by kind of libertarian ideology, but also science fiction narratives of governance by AI. The idea that AI can play a larger role in organizing society. Ian M. Banks's culture novels, for example, are a favorite of Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a big fan of those books, and you do get AIs exerting a kind of governance in the culture books against the background of an anarchist or libertarian utopia. And AI tools are also literally being kind of used in these processes. For example, thousands of federal employees were instructed to write a pulse check email describing their activities in the previous week. And these emails were then apparently processed by AI to kind of flag up potential cuts. Who will we keep and who will we fire? And this sort of practice, I think it's interesting, is clearly kind of speculative itself, in the sense that it's not just what AI can demonstrably do that's shaping this process, but what AI might do given new use cases or advances. So you might say it's not just kind of robots coming for their jobs, it's design fiction about robots coming for their jobs. So we've set up some important ingredients there, and I think we can now move into the second part of the talk. It's a 3-part talk, so we're beginning the second part. And I'm hoping by this point that there are some doubts, there are some objections. Wait a second, something's not quite right. This is all a bit too simplistic. Isn't he cherry picking similarities between science fiction and reality? For example, we were just talking about the AI in the culture novels, in Ian M. Banks's culture novels. They're not really much like our large language models from OpenAI and so on, apart from they do sometimes have a similar kind of cheery tone, similar to ChatGPT. Likewise, that machine described by E.M. Forster, it has more dissimilarities to the world that we live in than it does similarities. I drew the connection between the lectures that they give and this talk, but there are more differences than there are similarities. And even that autonomous car in the science fiction story, it appears far more kind of safe and intelligent than anything that humans have actually built. Besides, isn't a lot of science fiction not stories trying to make themselves real? Isn't a lot of science fiction stories trying to make sure that they don't become real? Dystopian cyberpunk, for example, is surely a cautionary tale. It's trying to ensure it doesn't become real. And haven't I been a little bit kind of narrow-minded and literal about the many ways that science fiction influences the imagination, influences innovation, and influences the future? Science fiction doesn't just represent possibilities in a straightforward way. It represents possibilities in veiled and indirect ways. It uses allegory, estrangement, and association. We're not comparing the science fictional world and the real world and then just simply choosing our favorite. We also see each of those worlds through the lens of the other. We see hybrid possibilities that blend elements of both. And sometimes in the interaction of the fictive and the real, there are possibilities that fly up that entirely transcend them both. And I think all of this is kind of more or less a slightly more nuanced account of the orthodox understanding of the relationship between science fiction and innovation. And we can clarify this a little bit more by bringing in critical design. So just as science fiction sometimes acts as design fiction, not always deliberately, just as it sometimes acts as a story that makes itself real, it may also often act as critical design. So what is critical design? Well, critical design is a practice that uses the skills and techniques of designers to question assumptions, spark conversations, and challenge the status quo. It's not just about creating a marketable product. In fact, it's often not about creating a product at all. Critical design often presents speculative or satirical artifacts that encourage reflection on social, ethical, or political uses. It may be about solving problems. It might be trying to solve a particular problem, but more often than not, it's about reframing problems or surfacing new problems, finding problems, making trouble. So, for example, rather than taking a particular need for granted, this need exists and we need to create a product or service that will serve this need and maybe make some money from it, critical design will try to intervene in ways that ask, well, why do we have this need? Do we need this need? What are the systems that give rise to the need in the first place? Again, an example will hopefully really convey what critical design tends to do. So Designs for an Overpopulated Planet, The Foragers, is about 15 years old by Dunn and Raby, and it combines kind of video and images and text, and it imagines communities of the future responding to food shortages using synthetic biology and DIY digestive devices inspired by the digestive systems of other mammals, non-human mammals, as well as birds and fish and insects. So it imagines these kind of slightly strange, creepy wearable devices that allow humans to metabolize non-traditional food substances, to eat grass, for example. So this critical design intervention isn't literally proposing that these technologies are a good idea. They're presented in a deliberately unsettling way. It's meant to kind of creep you out. It's supposed to raise awareness and provoke debate around environmental sustainability. And there is a pretty clear message here. We mustn't allow things to get to the stage where such technologies would be desirable. We mustn't allow things to get to the stage where such technologies would be necessary. So critical design is a bit closer to the term that I'm going to introduce in the third part, critical design fiction, because critical design does claim some capacity to affirm or to negate, to say, yes, we should do this, we should build this, or to say, no, this is not the future that we want. But I do wonder if actual examples of critical design are perhaps less able to say no than they think they are. And in this sense, perhaps less disruptive than they imagine themselves to be. Theorists of critical design, theorists and practitioners such as Dunn and Raby, distinguish critical design from affirmative design which merely reinforces the way things are heading. But with the benefit of a little hindsight, Designs for an Overpopulated Planet, I think, is making a serious ethical, aesthetic, and scientific mistake by framing the challenge of sustainable agriculture primarily as a population problem, and by using further devastation of biodiversity ecosystems as some sort of solution, eating grass, eating leaves. And perhaps the missing piece here, without spending too much time on it, is agroecology. So agroecology was already fairly well established when this work was made, having gained momentum in Latin America during the 80s and 90s in response to the Green Revolution. Peasant movements championed agroecology as part of the food sovereignty movement. So it's about land reform. It's about redistributive policies. It's about more democratic and equitable trade practices. And agroecology has grown into a global movement. That's not to say population growth isn't important as well. Critics of agroecology often question whether it's focused on decentralized participatory methods and its relatively low input techniques can really meet the demands of growing populations. But looking at Designs for an Overpopulated Planet, to be talking about technology, population, and food, the future of food, without centering distributional questions, without putting at the forefront how land and other natural resources are governed and stewarded, who owns what, who has responsibility for what, who has access to what, and that includes non-human others. To do that doesn't spark important conversations so much as it really closes them down. Or does it? I mean, I am having this sort of conversation, this rather one-sided conversation now. Well, I would say that at least something that is kind of intended to be disgusting or at least slightly unsettling, all these fictional technologies which allow humans to metabolize non-traditional food sources, well, there is kind of now a thriving food tech startup ecosystem. And that includes efforts to expand insect-based protein from cattle feed or novelty delicacies into mainstream human diet, eating insects like a bird or a frog, just as Dunn and Raby imagined, as well as kind of microbial protein snatched by these new techno-alchemies from out of thin air, rather like a photosynthesizing plant nourishing itself in the sun's rays. So I don't mean to say that Dunn and Raby's project inspired these developments or could have or should have prevented or modified them, but I am interested in things which first turn up in fiction as warnings as cautions, as saying you should not be allowed. I'm interested in when those things later turn up in reality in a very different kind of spirit and mood. They turn up with much fanfare and celebration, something we're supposed to be excited about, something we're supposed to build a new life around. And that really is the theme of the third part of this talk, critical design fiction. So thanks for coming this far. Critical design fiction is my own term, but I'm not proposing it as something new. I'm not saying that we should all go out and write or create critical design fiction, or that we need to find examples of it. I'm not really even claiming to have invented it, only to have given a name to certain pre-existing patterns, to a set of beliefs and attitudes around science fiction, which I take to be relatively common, even to be relatively common sense. And by critical design fiction, I mean fiction that influences what ideas we devote resources to exploring and developing, and what ideas we withhold resources from exploring and developing, as well as how we explore and develop those ideas. So when people talk about the relationship between science fiction and tech, I think they often implicitly assume that it functions in this way. Not all science fiction, they'll think not all science fiction, not all critical design, not all design fiction is going to meet all these criteria. It's not all going to be able to influence innovation in a kind of affirming way or in a kind of negative way. But the assumption is that sometimes it will. When you write science fiction, some of it will. If you're writing about something positively, you're going to make it more likely to happen, perhaps. If you're writing about something negatively, you might make it less likely to happen, perhaps. And I'm interested in making these assumptions more explicit. And that way we can test whether or not these assumptions are actually true. And we can also ask, and I think this is the really interesting bit for me, under what conditions are they true? Under what conditions is it possible for critical design fiction to exist? Do we live in those conditions? Perhaps those conditions exist with respect to certain technologies, but not others, or certain sectors and not others, or certain geographies, certain parts of the world and not others. Under what conditions are they true? So this wonderful tweet from Alex Blechman reads, "Sci-fi author, in my book, I have invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company, at long last, we have created the torment nexus from the classic sci-fi novel, Don't Create the Torment Nexus." So obviously it's implied that the sci-fi author is blameless here. The sci-fi author did nothing wrong. The tech company is a bad reader of science fiction. The sci-fi author made it as clear as they possibly could, and the tech company went and built the torment nexus anyway. I want to suggest a different way of thinking about this. I want to suggest a different way of thinking about torment nexuses. If a torment nexus is now a term for any fictional technology or institution or innovation that is presented in a cautionary way within science fiction or within speculative culture at large, including perhaps critical technology studies. There are two significant judgments that the fictional readership of the fictional book about the fictional technology would need to make. First, is the torment nexus plausible? Can you actually build such a thing? And second, would its impact really be undesirable? Would it have the kind of social and ecological impacts that are depicted in the book? Don't create the torment nexus. And any given member of the audience might agree with one or both of these statements. And that means there are at least 4 possible positions. First, the torment nexus is possible and it should not be built. This is perhaps the audience that the sci-fi author imagined when they wrote the sci-fi classic, Don't Create the Torment Nexus. But then there are those who disagree with both statements. They think actually a torment nexus would be lovely. If only we could have a lovely torment nexus that would produce so much joy and so many benefits, it wouldn't produce torment at all. However, the torment nexus is a fanciful dream. The sci-fi author meaning that person might be quite amused to discover that these fans exist and also a bit unnerved. Oh, I didn't make it clear. I might have to make my message a bit more clear next time. And then, of course, there are those who partly agree with the sci-fi author. They don't actually think it's plausible, but they do think it would be bad if it did exist. And here the sci-fi author is again on maybe slightly safer territory. Okay, well, at least they understood the point of the book. At least they understood the message. I might maybe have been able to do better in making it feel more kind of plausible. I'll think about that for next time. But then there is the fourth response. There is the fourth response. I agree that it is possible. I disagree that it is bad. Now, there are many variations of this. This reader or audience member might think of some kind of regulation or safety feature or some kind of use case or social embedding, which the sci-fi author has not anticipated. And this might justify their interpretation that actually this torment nexus would be a welcome development. And I will remain neutral about whether such an audience is actually a better or worse judge of the situation than the sci-fi author. They could perhaps be right sometimes. But given these four responses, here now is the significant question for us. Does writing "Don't create the torment nexus" make it more or less likely that one gets created? And the answer, of course, is that it depends, but what does it depend on? Well, there are lots of ways of approaching this, and I think we could get into a lot of depth here. But let's take an approach where we think about the way power is distributed across different actors in the innovation kind of ecosystem and different actors across society at large, and how these different actors or agents, institutions, whatever you want to call them, what kind of relationship they have with science fiction. And that might be a direct thing where they're kind of actually reading or watching science fiction themselves. It's often going to be a more mediated thing where they're getting it secondhand or third hand. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, let's assume that the vast majority of responses are exactly what the sci-fi author wanted. They are covered, say, by the first three categories, and especially the first category. Most of the audience are persuaded by the author's stance. They understand the cautionary tale. They agree. Don't create the torment nexus. So what does this actually do? How are they persuaded? What influence do they then pass on? This could influence news coverage of proposed technologies or fledgling technologies. It could influence sectoral approval and testing processes, the identification of risks and harms, whether or not investors are interested or whether they kind of stay well away, whether consumers demand a product or whether they resist it. I like to think of Google Glass and the Google Glass hole as an interesting example of consumers resisting something pushed upon us. It might influence legislation. These could all be vectors which prevent harms or limit harms. And then the next two categories, well, let's say for the sake of argument, there are a few who think it's impossible. And the impact here is maybe more mixed and uncertain. If they kind of are influenced by the science fiction work, but the main thing they take from it is it doesn't feel plausible to them. They could disengage from the whole process. Oh, that's never going to happen. They could be skeptical about both those promoting a technology and those opposing it. Well, you people seem very gullible, like you're proposing something out of far-fetched science fiction, so I won't really engage in that process. Then let's say there is a very small section of people who are influenced by this science fiction story, who fall into this fourth category. This category of people who think it's plausible, but think it would be a good idea. And here again, it could influence all those kinds of actors that I mentioned before: news coverage, sectoral approval and testing processes, consumers, lawmakers. But I think crucially, it could also influence future studies people, horizon scanners, entrepreneurs, people who are always looking for the next big thing, investors, venture capital, research funders, the design and wording of innovation competitions, early stage kind of startups and scale-ups who might be looking to expand their offering, find some sort of gap, foundations, maybe philanthropic foundations looking for some kind of solution to challenges and problems that they've developed. In other words, a whole set of actors who, even if they are a small part of the audience of these types of science fiction, can wield a lot of influence. Agency is not distributed equally amongst these four categories. In the forest, a dry twig catches fire, and that's not automatically extinguished by the damp twig that does not catch fire. The many people who kind of understand the intent and purport of the story don't necessarily dampen the enthusiasm and the vast resources of those who take what we could call the wrong message. I'm not even sure if we should call it the wrong message, if this is something that is kind of fairly predictable, if this is something that that the science fiction author and that science fiction critics and that critical technology practitioners can expect will happen because it's happened in the past. And I want to give you a kind of I think what is an interesting example of some of these dynamics playing out. And I've written this chapter in the Routledge Handbook of AI and Literature, which looks into this concept of critical design fiction in a bit more depth. Hopefully something you should be able to get in your libraries. I'm very happy to provide a copy for anybody who's interested if you can't. So this is a collaboration between Kai-Fu Lee and Chen Qifan, one of whom is a computer scientist, a kind of very senior personnel at Google for a time, and has then kind of gone on to do his own investments in AI, and is a very kind of powerful and influential figure in the field of AI, and the other of whom is a respected and very interesting, well-established science fiction author. And they've collaborated apparently quite closely on this book, which consists of stories and essays. And for convenience, I'll describe the essays as being written by Lee, and the stories as being written by Chen. But I think they are both kind of partly responsible for aspects of each. It's more mixed up in reality. So, for example, Chen's story, The Golden Elephant, critically examines a near-future machine learning-driven insurance platform, health insurance, through the experience of a user, Nayana. Nayana's mother signs a contract granting Ganesh Insurance extensive data surveillance rights in return for inexpensive premiums. GI monitors its customers' activities and uses machine learning processes to adjust their premiums. The company also becomes the preferred portal for various goods and services, so that gives it opportunities to kind of steer and nudge Nayana and her family in all aspects of their lives towards what it thinks of as a kind of healthy lifestyle. This kind of feedback loop, by the way, is well described in Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Better data leads to more control leads to better data. It is a dystopian story. It fits in with a kind of raft of short fiction, or a wave, I should say, of short fiction about algorithmic governmentality, the kind of loss of agency, or the problems around surveillance. And when Lee begins his commentary on The Golden Elephant, he begins by saying, the benefits of Ganesh Insurance powered by deep learning AI are clear in The Golden Elephant. And as Lee's commentary unfolds, it becomes clear he isn't actually joking. He really sees this as a story about how great it would be to to have this particular torment nexus installed in you and your family's phones. He praises the lures that have ensnared Nayana's family into an apartheid apparatus of surveillance and control. He downplays themes of class and caste almost to the point of erasure. His mostly glowing account is tempered by a few reflections on a couple pitfalls and downsides and trade-offs. This pattern continues, actually, I think, throughout the book. There will be a story that presents a kind of nuanced account of a AI technology, some good sides, some bad sides. I think the Golden Elephant is one of the kind of more negative portrayals, and then Lee's story will produce a far more optimistic account of that same technology. Twin Sparrows, another tale, relates the story of two orphan twins, Golden Sparrow and Silver Sparrow, and this is about AI as a kind of personalized learning agent and companion, I suppose. They get these things called VPALs, which are sophisticated adaptive AIs that become their constant companions. The two kids are temperamentally really, really different. They become estranged. They do have a kind of happy ending, a bittersweet ending many years later. But you really get to kind of compare and contrast the positive and the negative possibilities of this technology. And it really relates to their life circumstances as well as their temperaments and their neurodiversity. Because each experiences a different set of parents and a different style of parenting. Silver Sparrow is allowed to try a more free-form artistic education, mostly in AI-enriched solitude. Neurodiversity is a central theme in Silver Sparrow's VPAL, helps him to mediate between his own needs and the expectations of those around him. But for Golden Sparrow, the VPAL sucks. Ataman is very limited as a source of comfort, guidance, and empowerment, and arguably is even becomes a kind of tool of abuse wielded by Golden Sparrow's adoptive father. Twin Sparrows sounds a clear note of caution. AI can be used to improve or to degrade the quality of education, according to the story. Some uses of AI may improve the quality of education in a narrow sense while inflicting harm or exacerbating vulnerability in society at large. In a society where childcare is largely privatized via nuclear families, some of whom are dominated by abusive people like Golden Sparrow's father, Jun Ho, and where schooling has become a site of unremitting surveillance, quantification, and artificial competition, deploying educational AI responsibly is going to be, at best, extremely challenging. Again, Lee takes a different angle on this stuff. Golden Sparrow was tutored by his favorite cartoon character, Ataman, which made learning more fun. So just as class and caste is downplayed in the previous story, The Golden Elephant, familial power is downplayed in Twin Sparrows. The commentary doesn't acknowledge the plurality of views within pedagogy, educational psychology, educational philosophy. Lee is not kind of claiming to be an expert in education, but he doesn't really draw on the expertise that is out there or reflect on the position that he speaks from or its limitations. There's a very cursory exploration of interaction between education and broader social systems. As an educator, I find this, it doesn't make me very happy. High quality education is supposedly going to be universalized through AI teachers with near zero marginal costs. And there's a proposal that teaching is still going to be an invaluable profession, especially in wealthier societies. In an essay on another story, The Isle of Happiness, Lee kind of doubles down on this proposal that happiness itself can be technologically modeled, monitored, and optimized with AI. Again, despite the fact that The Isle of Happiness, the story on which it's based, kind of portrays these things going wrong, portrays an experiment of this kind failing. Lee does give a kind of account of how kind of complicated and daunting it would be to build a scientifically rigorous and robust happiness optimizing engine, a kind of joy nexus. Nonetheless, he's unwilling to abandon the hope of positive social change. That's kind of his job here. That's his role. And so he eventually declares all these risks, challenges, and pitfalls to be more or less irrelevant. By 2041, he says, and he doesn't really have much evidence for this, he says, AI's ability to read human emotions should be quite advanced, well beyond human capabilities. There's nothing in the literature really actually to support that kind of claim. Happiness can and should be monitored for Lee through subjective reports, continuous monitoring of hormones, Internet of Things devices to capture user behavior, facial expressions, and voice, to recognize each user's emotion, the hue of different parts of the face, the pitch, loudness, tempo, emphasis, and stability of the voice, trembling hands, dilated pupils. Lee thinks this is a great idea, this future where we're being surveilled by AI and everybody believes that the AI knows the meaning of our feelings and what's going on inside us better than we know ourselves. Okay, so what about the data privacy implications? What happens when a human says, "Oh, there's something bad has happened. There's been some sort of harm because of how an AI has used our data." So his suggestion here is to place powerful AIs under the supervision, wait for it, oh dear, of a single gigantic trusted AI that knows everything that Google, Facebook, and Amazon knows about us and much more. His solution is more data surveillance, the biggest AI yet. And when you accuse an AI of wrongdoing, this gigantic AI will be the judge of your claim. It will exonerate other AIs of their wrongdoing. All of this, he, by the way, says should be set in motion by strong leaders with the support of the populace. So Chen's stories mix techno-optimism with cautionary and dystopian ingredients. Chen wants to challenge the stereotype of the dystopian AI narrative and present a nuanced picture of AI. He wants to present risks and opportunities, miracles and tragedies, high stakes and a great deal of uncertainty. So in this respect, these stories appear to me to be promising candidates for critical design fiction. If anything is critical design fiction about AI, surely this should be it. Critical design fiction is supposed to accommodate, in addition to positive depictions of innovations, a range of vital perspectives characterized by an emphatic no. This is not the future we want, and perhaps can mix these things together so that we can steer ourselves by the things that are desirable and the things that are undesirable. But I would suggest that, on balance, even these thoughtful and ambitious stories constitute only uncritical design fiction. In other words, what is really striking is how quickly and how effectively these stories can be neutralized in terms of their doubts and their nuances simply by Lee's commentary. And what Lee does in his commentary, I would suggest, is a kind of microcosm of what can happen in tech journalism, tech commentary, and the general discourses of the innovation and the discourses of the innovation ecosystem at large. In other words, Lee allows us to see quite quickly how a nuanced story or a critical story can be filtered and transformed into cheerleading for a particular technology. But even if he wasn't doing it, even if Lee didn't exist, those same processes exist in society and culture at large. So here's this question: is it actually possible to write cautionary tales that are effective? And we might say again about tech. We could go a little bit further and ask, is it even possible to write cautionary tales that are not counterproductive? Is it a matter of just kind of sending ideas out there and those ideas will be taken up by the institutions and the economic interests and the sociocultural predispositions that are out there, and they will be stripped of all their nuance and stripped of their capacity to say no, to reject, or to say slow down, or to say this needs to be better regulated, or it needs to not exist at all. I don't know, but I will allow Lee to have the final word, and this is I think something that demonstrates kind of once you're in this kind of world of science fiction and tech and futurism, how it's possible to say some extremely silly things without recognizing their silliness. And I hope that recontextualizing it in this talk will make that a little bit clearer. So Lee suggests in one of his essays, a benevolent monarch has strong trust from his or her subjects and possesses the courage to implement major changes. If we could all just give all our data to a trusted entity that is interest aligned with us, then we could enjoy the most powerful AI to help us find lasting happiness, where we would no longer have to be puzzled with whether to consent to data uses by myriad applications. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to stick around for a couple minutes if we want to have a little bit of discussion and to hear your thoughts about science fiction, about technology, about AI, or about whatever's on your minds.
That was great. Thank you very much for the nice presentation. So if anybody has any question, you can raise your hand and turn your webcam on and ask the question.
Thank you. I feel like I should give you links to find out more if you're interested.
Can I ask a question myself?
Yeah, of course.
So what about some, less tangible, more abstract concepts? So here we're thinking that we're considering science fiction as a harbinger of something which will happen in future, especially when it comes to technology, like, I don't know, mass controlling, I don't know, VR, body mutation, all of these things, which can be counterproductive most of the time. It doesn't have not any, but let's say the negative aspects of it are more bold. Now, what about, more social practices, or let's say some ethical issues raised in some fictions, and how we are somehow replicating them and living them right now? Because I guess throughout your presentation, the focus was more on tangible aspects of it rather than more abstract ethical practices. So what about that?
That's a lovely question. Thank you. I did focus quite a bit on tech in this presentation. I guess when I'm talking about tech, I'm always also interested in the intangible aspects of tech. So that includes, how does technology interact with social customs, with behavioral norms, with expectations? How do certain affordances exist for technology that shape the way that it is used? You'll sometimes get this with AI. You often hear this this kind of maxim, this slogan, this truism that says AI is neither good or bad. It's simply a tool. It can be used for good or for bad. And this is something that I guess I strongly disagree with. First of all, I disagree with the word just or merely. You can't say that something is just a tool or merely a tool. The tools that we have influence the way that we behave. They influence the way that we see the world. They influence the way that we interact with one another. Another good truism or slogan is, when your only tool is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. So the fact that AI is a tool doesn't mean that really solves any kind of important ethical questions about its usage. I think that AI or specific instances or instantiations of AI will always have kind of embedded politics, embedded tendencies and predispositions. There's a really wonderful set of questions. I can't remember who it's by now, but I think, or the exact number, it's either 76 or 78. But if you Google 76 reasonable questions to ask about any technology, or maybe it's 78 reasonable questions to ask about any technology, there's a really kind of fantastic set of exercises, deliberately exhaustingly long, deliberately comprehensive as they can possibly make it. That I think begins to bridge that distinction between, on the one hand, technology, the kind of hard, solid, tangible stuff, and then on the other hand, the broader set of social practices, cultural systems and institutions, ecology as well, of course. So that's one kind of answer to your question. The other shorter answer is that I'm very interested in science fiction that is more about social institutions. In fact, I'm kind of most of the time, I'm more interested in that kind of science fiction. And, I have written about it a little bit. My friend Liz Steinfurth and I wrote about AI in the context of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed. That essay's out there. And I'm currently working on a book about post-capitalism and science fiction, which is really thinking about science fiction that depicts alternative social arrangements. Thank you. That was a big long answer. Maybe if there is one more question, maybe we do have time for one more question.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the answer. It was great and thought-provoking. And I also dropped a link that you said 76 questions. I guess it was in the chat box. Yeah.
Right.
So now, if no one else has any question, we can call the day and finish the session.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope everybody has a fantastic day. And who knows what the future holds? Can't wait to find out.
Can you just speculate it? I mean, at this very moment, to see what it holds for us. So
I hope everybody's feeling cheerful and optimistic. And when things are bad, I always find it's a good idea just to try and find them funny, because they're usually funny. Okay, great. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much. See you later.
Great.
Bye.
So thank you everyone for joining us today, and please follow us on Instagram and other social media to be updated for other upcoming webinars. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.